One of the questions that I get relatively often is hey, I play in a homebrew game, and I know that the 8 steps from Return of the Lazy Dungeon Master are best used when you're running published campaign settings or published adventures. And then I get other people who say, hey, I run using published settings and published adventures, and I know that the 8 steps from Return are actually built for doing homebrew campaign stuff. How do I do it? And which is always funny, because it's really written to be able to support both. But you don't always necessarily use this 8 steps from Return of the Lazy Dungeon Master in the same way, depending on the circumstances of your game. I have an article on Sly Flourish called Choosing the Right Steps from the Lazy DM Checklist, which talks about how you would pick which of the steps from Return of the Lazy Dungeon Master to use under different circumstances. And it's not even just easy between saying whether or not you're using published stuff or whether you're doing homebrew stuff, but it's also stuff like, are you running a one-shot game? Are you at the beginning of a campaign? Are you in the middle of a campaign? What kind of adventure you're running? So we're going to talk a little bit today about which steps you're going to use depending on which style of game you're going to play. So for just a quick 30-second summary on what the 8 steps from Return of the Lazy Dungeon Master are, and by the way, you can find a link that talks about the 8 steps, other videos that I've done about the 8 steps, and of course you can pick up Return of the Lazy Dungeon Master. I don't know why you wouldn't. That includes the 8 steps and describes them thoroughly. But just for a quick summary of the 8 steps are review the characters, create a strong start, outline potential scenes, define secrets and clues, develop fantastic locations, outline important NPCs, choose relevant monsters, and select magic item rewards. Those are the 8 steps. And the idea behind those 8 steps is that you are getting all of the things you need prepared to help you to be able to be flexible and to be able to improvise during the game itself. So that's the intent of the 8 steps. But one of the things about the 8 steps, and there's a chapter in Return that specifically talks about this, is you can select which steps are useful for you, not overall, but also at the moment. Which times do you need them? And if you've watched me do my Lazy GM Prep videos, I don't know why you would. There's like a million of them, but let's say you have in those, you can watch me deciding which steps I need for the game. Because really what it comes down to is what steps do I feel like I need in order to run the game I'm going to run. There are some steps that I argue almost always provide a good value, regardless of the kind of game that you're running. 2 steps in particular that I always tend to do, regardless of them, is what's the strong start and what secrets and clues do I have? Those 2 steps in particular are super, super valuable. Now, another one, though, is reviewing the characters is almost always valuable whenever you know who the characters are. But if you happen to be running like a convention game, or you're running a game where the players are bringing their own characters, you don't know who they are, reviewing the characters isn't necessarily a step you can do. So that's a circumstance where that one step doesn't make a lot of sense. But anytime you do know who the characters are, even if you're going to be providing pre-gens to people, you can still think about all of the pre-gens that you're going to offer and put them out there. Now, if you're offering 12 pre-gens for 6 players or 5 players, maybe then it's not that worthwhile. But generally speaking, if you have any inclination into who the characters are, you can review the characters. I heard a really good tip that I'll offer, and somebody else brought this up, which is even if you don't know the characters, if you know the players, you can review the players and know what kind of style they're going to bring to the game, what kind of things you know about them and what they enjoy, and then use that to help you steer the rest of the prep for your game. So even if you don't know who the characters are, if you know who the players are, that's still some information that you can use during that first step of reviewing the characters. The strong start is useful almost anytime you're going to run a game. Even if you're in the middle of a campaign, if you're in the middle of an adventure, but you're starting a new session, what is the scene that you're going to put in there that's going to draw the players directly into the action? What is the thing that's going to get them to say, to leave our real world and jump into the world we're creating together? That strong start is almost always super, super important. Many times, if you're in the middle of a campaign, you already know what it's going to be. I'm a big fan of leaving on a cliffhanger, so you're just getting started with a great big fight or just something really exciting happens. Then you've already wired in your strong start. That's a really good trick. It's like, can you end in a situation where you've already revealed the strong start and you know that at the next session you're going to run, the strong start is what's going to occur. But now if you're also running like a one-shot game, or you're running a game even if you're running like a published adventure, if the published adventure doesn't have a strong start, you can add one. If it does, you don't necessarily need to prep the step, except to maybe write down scene 1 from the book. Like if the adventure already has a strong start, you don't need to make one, but it's worth your time to know what it is and to be ready to run it. Outlining potential scenes is something where sometimes you need it, sometimes you don't, and the circumstances for that one step can really happen in lots of different ways. Does the book already have a very clear structure for how the adventure is going to play out? Do you already know where it's going to go? Or do you know that there's no way you can outline those scenes because you really have no idea where it's going to go? So I've talked before about how the outlining of potential scenes is really a catch-all step where you could put everything from like, what are the next steps that the characters can choose from at the end of the session, or just a very loose outline like explore the dungeon, or can capture very specific things for you. So you can really do a lot with potential scenes, but sometimes you just might not need to use it at all. If you already know if the adventure is covering everything that you need, if you already have it in mind, then you can throw away the potential scenes. I think I've mentioned this before. That was the one step that I added pretty late in the game when I was working on Return to the Lazy Dungeon Master, mostly because I saw so many people using a step like that. And I'm really glad I added it in because it's a step I use all the time myself. And I think it is a very valuable catch-all step for covering sort of the structure of the adventure that you're going to run, whether it's published, whether it's homebrew, whether it's at the beginning of a campaign, whether it's in the middle of a campaign, however you're using it, it's still a good idea to give you just a little bit of a bound of like, I'm going to be spending 3 hours with my friends today. What are the things that could occur during that 3-hour game? And what choices could I put in front of the players at the end of this session so that I know where it's going to go next? Defining secrets and clues is another one where I feel like even if you're running published adventures or your own homebrew adventure, or you're in the middle of a campaign or at the beginning of a campaign, or you're doing a one-shot game, having those 10 secrets and clues is a great way to kind of fill in all of the details and fill in all of the cracks of your adventure and wrap your whole adventure in interesting lore that makes your game different from session to session, or makes your game different than any other game that the players are playing. It's designed to be very straightforward and very easy to do. Of course, coming up with this kind of lore can always be a little bit tricky, but it's just one sentence. You're not writing out giant tomes of background material. You're just doing the sentences. But even if you have a big, thick adventure, like I'm running Empire of the Ghouls, which has tons of lore in it, every session it's still useful for me to kind of go through the adventure, pick out the elements that I think are the important bits that the characters are going to discover or could discover in the next session, and write them out of my list of 10. So I really feel like secrets and clues, along with a strong start, are valuable no matter what kind of adventure you're running: published, homebrew, one-shot game, the beginning of a campaign, or the middle of a campaign. However you're running your game, I really feel like secrets and clues is a valuable step that can offer a whole lot to fill in so much of your adventure for not a ton of work on the preparation side. Fantastic locations is definitely one of those that changes depending on the style of adventure you're running and on what material you already have available. So developing fantastic locations could be something as simple as saying, what are the backdrops to each of the scenes that I'm going to have in my next session? Let's say I'm running a 3-hour game. That's about 5 different scenes that are going to play out. What are the locations that those scenes are going to have? Or the characters are traveling in the overland. What are 3 interesting locations they might run into while they're traveling in the overland? Or they're going through these big chambers of a relatively linear dungeon. What are those chambers like? But then you could have like a dungeon crawl where you have, a dozen or 24 different chambers that the characters could go through. Well, then your fantastic location changes to defining each of those chambers with just enough information to give you an idea what's going on there so that you can improvise the rest of that location if the characters head there. What I've enjoyed doing recently is printing out like a Dyson Logos map and taking a pen to it and just writing on the map the little one-word or 2-word descriptions of what might be in those chambers, and then printing that out and throwing it in my notes so that I have just a very, very loose list of the kinds of locations that the characters might explore during their game. Now, if you are playing a published adventure, it's possible that all those locations are already filled out in the adventure. Then you don't need to worry about this step. It can help you to review what's in those chambers, especially for the next session that you're running. But if it's already there, you generally don't have to worry about it. Also, if you're running a game with like a lot of random components, like Shadow Dark or something like that, maybe you don't say, well, I'm not going to worry too much about it. I'm just going to roll the dice when the game is playing. So fantastic locations is very valuable, but not always necessarily the same way. And in some circumstances, you might not have to do it at all. Outlining important NPCs. This is another one where published material might have you covered. If you publish material, like a published adventure or a campaign source book already has good pictures and descriptions of NPCs, and you feel feel like that's what you really need, then that can work great. Now, you might say, yeah, except they're kind of spread all out and I need to have a reference. You might still list out the NPCs that you think are important and the page numbers where you can find them in the source book. I'm a huge fan, and I highly recommend that in your game notes, you write down the page numbers of things like monsters or NPCs so that you can quickly look them up from the book while it's sitting there in front of you. Even if you're playing online, sure, you can link it in your online notes and that works too. But I still like playing with physical books even if I'm playing online, and it's still useful for me to write down the page numbers of things like monsters and NPCs. So you could definitely do that. You could also, if you wanted to, if you thought it would be valuable, you could roll up some random NPCs and just get little bits of stat lines down, or not even stat lines, just like descriptions of the NPCs down in your NPC list. That can change depending on whether or not they're going to be running into NPCs. Which NPCs might they run into? Again, published material might already have NPCs in there, so you don't need to spend as much time on them. Homebrew, I need to spend more time on it. What I find is I generally only need the name. If I could just name the NPC, I can usually improvise everything else, but it can definitely help. Choosing relevant monsters. Again, a published material might already have this in there for you. They might have random lists of monsters. They might have monsters associated with particular locations if you're going through like a dungeon crawl. But sometimes you might want to list out those monsters anyway, or give yourself a reference to where those monsters exist. If you're doing a homebrew adventure, you probably want to list out what monsters you think might be relevant to the adventure that you're going to run. Again, I really like either linking them if you're using digital notes, or write down the page number for a physical book so you know where to look up that stat block or that information when you're putting their monsters in. Sometimes you may not need this step because the monsters are already covered in the adventure. Other times you might need it. And the same thing is true with selecting magic item rewards. Sometimes I think even in published adventures, I still like to roll up some random treasure parcels that I can have in my back pocket so that while the characters are exploring, if they find an area where it makes sense for treasure, I have something I can just drop right in. It's really, really easy to do. But sometimes those treasure parcels or specific treasure are already laid out in the book. And again, if you have a published adventure and you're like, no, the loot's already covered, or you're playing a game like Shadow Dark where you roll randomly for treasure, well, then you don't need to worry about it as much. You're going to roll at the table. You can have your players roll. I like to have players roll the dice on treasure tables. They don't know what the listing is, but they roll it, and that way they feel like they're more directly connected to the treasure that they picked up. I've had it where they rolled a 00 on a treasure table, which meant they got like a super powerful artifact, and they totally got the super powerful artifact. Now it's helping the whole party. So that's definitely one. So sometimes you might spend more time with your magic item rewards. Other times you might just be selecting what's ever in a published module, or sometimes you might just be rolling randomly. So I hope this gives you an idea of like the different ways that you can use these steps. If you take nothing else from this, the main thing that I would recommend is that the strong start and your secrets and clues are really valuable steps that can help you with pretty much any kind of game that you're running, whether it's a homebrew game, whether it's a published game, whether it's a one-shot game, or whether it's right at the beginning of a campaign or somewhere in the middle of a campaign. I really feel like that those two steps in particular offer the biggest bang for the buck for helping you get your hands around the adventure you're going to run. And for the other steps, it's really contextual. Do you know who the characters are? Then yes, it's almost certainly useful for reviewing the characters. Do you know what scenes might occur? Do you need to get your hands around the structure of the adventure? Then the scene step can help you out. Do you have a big location that you want to fill out or review, or a map that you want to fill out with details? Then fantastic locations can help you out. Do you want to make sure that you have a handle on what NPCs could show up? The NPC step, monsters, treasure, same sort of thing. If you like this show and you want to see more stuff like this, you can subscribe to the Sly Flourish newsletter. It is absolutely free to sign up. You get a free adventure generator for signing up, and you get a weekly RPG-related email sent directly to your inbox that includes links to all of the other work that I do. You can also subscribe to the Patreon, where you get access to things like the Patreon Q&A, a dedicated Discord server, the best of Sly Flourish, Lightning 5e, lots of stuff you get. Tons and tons of material that you get for being a patron of Sly Flourish. And you can pick up any of my books, including Return of the Lazy Dungeon Master, the Lazy DM's Workbook, the Lazy DM's Companion, Fantastic Adventures, all kinds of books available on the Sly Flourish bookstore. Thank you all very much. Have a great day, and get out there and play an RPG.